This is the Overton Pod. Welcome, Kanthan.
Thank you very much for that fabulous bagel.
Oh, it's only a pleasure. Only a pleasure. Just down the road from the studio here, actually, some really, really good.
I
really
saw
good
a
food.
very recent survey that showed that Johannesburg was either the second.
Yes, Time Out or something.
Yeah, Time
which
Out
does,
said Johannesburg was the second best place in the world for food.
So I think they might be pushing it a little bit.
No, I don't think so.
But
because
look, I think second is that's why. But I've always felt Joburg has great food, and in fact, South Africa. If you've travelled anywhere else in the world, our food is really tasty and varied. You can find pretty much any food and made well.
We've got grass-fed beef. Let's just start with that.
Yeah.
We've got grass-fed beef. It's not feedlot cattle that's, slaughtered amidst tobacco spit and all of that.
It's hilarious to me because some of the steakhouses you go to will they've got the option. You can ask them if they've got in stock like USDA cattle, so American beef essentially, and it's at a massive premium. I've never bought it before, but it's at a significant premium. And I always think to myself, why? Or Angus beef for that matter from the UK. And I always think to myself, why? Why would you not just have South African beef? It's far superior.
Yes, especially if you consider that the American stuff is all hormone injected. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, if you really want your estrogen levels to be up a notch or two.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, talking about estrogen, Rise Mzansi didn't get any votes, basically. So that's good. I know you're looking at the numbers as we speak, so now you're going to correct me.
They do have 2 seats. So.
They do have 2 seats, which is one better than Patricia de Lille.
And Bosa's got 2 seats.
And Musi Mamani can take a friend to Parliament, basically.
Exactly, yeah. But it's not going to be his wife because she's got white privilege, remember?
Yes, he would never give his wife anything because basically, she's got everything in her life so far because she's white. So that would be just out of turn. Right, so let's talk these elections because those parties we named are really irrelevant and let's hope they remain that way. None of them are particularly important. But let's talk about the parties that are important.
Well, let's just say for the record that the way in which we called it in our last session has come true almost without exception.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you most of the credit for that because I had some predictions, but I think you got it more spot on with regards to MK.
But also with regard to the DA. Remember, I said that the DA would lose fractionally in the Western Cape, but they would still keep the Western Cape,
yes,
which they did.
Yeah,
and there would also be an uptick in terms of their numbers, particularly in terms of Gauteng, which was great.
Yeah. So, and we still got to find out what happens with Gauteng. I want to do what we did last time similarly, which is let's have the big national discussion, which is what everyone really wants to talk about. Who's going to end up in government, the ministries, the presidency, etc., and what's likely to happen in Parliament in terms of committees and all that. And then we'll talk about the provincial stuff, which I think hasn't been looked at closely just yet because everyone's really focused on the national stuff. Obviously, really a historic election. I know that word gets used out of turn and out of place a lot. But for me, you'd have to say the ANC dropping below a majority and not just borderline below a majority. Had they been 48, 49%, they could have said to ATM, come in, PAC come in, and they could have formed a government quite easily, given those guys whatever they wanted, really. But 40% means they really have to make a deal. Wherever that ends up being, there really is a deal to be made. They truly have lost power. There is no one in this country any longer who can claim to be the ruling party, so to speak, because nobody has a majority anymore. And perhaps let's kick it off from there, because there's a few people who will be listening who will say things like, well, Jonathan, ANC didn't get a majority, but if you add the ANC and the MK, who is basically the former ANC president, and the EFF, who's the former Youth League president, then they're back at almost a 2/3 majority. I think 64.8%. I stand slightly corrected on that number. So what do you say to that?
I think that people are still wanting to think along the lines of the ANC is this monolithic structure and everyone ultimately owes allegiance to it. I think that if you look over the course of the 30 years, so every single new party that has emerged, almost without exception, has come from within the ranks of the ANC.
Correct.
So if you compare where we are today versus where we were 30 years ago, we're pretty much in the same place, because you've had a fragmentation of the ANC collective. Because remember that, if you go back to the 50s, the PAC came out of the ANC. You go to the 60s, IFP came out of the ANC. If you go, so ultimately, it's basically been the DA.
And even to today's like small parties you never heard of, NFPs, ATMs, they're all ultimately somewhat linked either
NFP
with
came,
IFP.
NFP came out of the IFP.
Which came out of the ANC.
Yeah. But there are all of these rats and mice parties. But
Yes.
fundamentally, if you take the view that Thabo Mbeki managed to unite the ANC and get a 2/3 majority in 2009, and was it 2009 or was it 2004? Sorry.
Yes, 2004 I think was his
2004.
66%.
Yes, 2004 was when he hit 66%. And if you now take the collective, as in the ANC plus MK plus the EFF, they effectively have a collective that's close to that figure.
Yeah.
So there hasn't really been a change. If you look in terms of what the DA has done.
So is it in fact not historic then? Is it in fact not a big deal? Have we had a situation where nothing has changed?
It absolutely is historic, because remember that one of the things I've been saying for the longest time is that we need the ANC to split. Because when the ANC splits, you're still going to have the same players, but decisions will now get made in Parliament. They won't get made in Luthuli House anymore.
Yeah.
And that is friggin' huge.
Yep.
Because that means that
True democracy.
Yeah, the debates actually take place, and you're going to have line-by-line votes on budgets instead of it being allocated in Luthuli House and a rubber stamp gets applied.
And I think there's something very interesting as well, which I'd like to point to, which is MK is... and this is a point I want to get to about the right and left wing politics, but MK is a Zulu party. And
I wouldn't go that far. I'd say that, so they're largely ethno-nationalist. Let's be very clear about that. But there's an astonishing amount of support that comes out of their Zulu base.
Yeah, so they got some support in Mpumalanga, for example.
So Mpumalanga is a good example. One might argue that it's a predominantly Zulu-speaking parts of Mpumalanga that voted for them. But it doesn't explain...
the only reason I say that is just to point out that before, when you had a combined ANC, they managed to control all the sort of tribalistic tendencies on whichever side they had come from.
No, they didn't. I disagree.
Well, there was internally, perhaps not.
Sure.
But what I'm saying is, to govern, they certainly did. And there was sort of the ANC way and the ANC direction. And obviously, we've seen fractures in this since Jacob Zuma became president, essentially.
Yes.
But now you've got that as a separate entity, and I think it's going to be very hard to put that genie back into the ANC bottle.
Yes.
I don't see that happening easily. Do you?
So I think there's a couple of possibilities that we need to look at, and I think a lot of it is going to depend on where the discussions end up going between all of the people who are doing horse trading right now. So there are two possible routes that we need to look at.
Hold on, before you get there. I want to just nail down who's done well and where we are before we go what we're going to do with it. Before we get into the actual numbers. So there was a big push yesterday. Major is a relative term, but the typical sort of left-wing accounts on Twitter who have influence. Richard Poplack from the Daily Maverick, Reedy Clubby from the CIA, or what is she, Atlantic Fellow now, funded by the CIA, whatever. Our former public prosecutor who is with every tweet shows people that there are very big questions about her ability to think. Tuli Madonsela, and then there was also Pierre de Force. So you get the idea. The typical.
I think you give them too much credit by calling them people with influence.
Yeah,
I think they have loud voices.
yeah, they have loud
I
voices.
don't think anyone takes them seriously.
I would say that they are voices of the South African sort of middle class left, so to speak. Okay.
In other words, they're the Rise Mzansi supporters who represent
Yeah, absolutely.
what percentage of the populace are we talking about?
1.2%
okay.
or something like
that.
Right. Here's what I'm going to say, is they all came out simultaneously within hours of each other, as if it was a talking point, kind of like you see that happens on the American news channels. And they all came within hours of each other. Oh, Adam Habib as well, up in the UK there, a whole vice chancellor of a university calling the MK and the EFF right wing. All of them came out with the same talking point. What do you think that's about?
I think it's always a question of trying to spin a particular narrative that's then able to appeal to global funders to then tie into the entire narrative that goes with globalization, which has always been the case. You look in terms of the vocabulary that gets used, it has to fit within that particular dictionary. And right-wing and fascist have been weaponized. Correctly so in the case of Nazi Germany.
In the case of actual fascists.
In the case of,
turns out that's okay.
Yes. But when you apply it to anyone whose views that you don't necessarily like, simply on the basis that they primarily have an anti-globalist agenda. Now, it's very clear that that MK has an anti-globalist agenda. It's very clear that the EFF has an anti-globalist agenda.
Well, I think you could debate that with regards. I mean, a lot of people said one of the reasons Julius lost votes, and it's interesting because I saw this said many times over and over by people who don't have influence. I don't recognize their names. I don't know their accounts. This is social media, but small following accounts, and then some interviews on television as well, where people were saying when Julius stood up and basically said South Africa is for Africa, and open borders and all that kind of stuff, which is a globalist point. That turned a lot of people off.
Well, a globalist point within Africa, which is a very different thing from saying, let us open our doors to migrants from Europe.
My issue is this. I think they look at something like MK and Jacob Zuma making rumblings about if you finalize the votes, there's going to be trouble with the sort of hint that trouble equals violence behind it. I think they look at it and go, okay, the country is on a bit of a precipice at the moment. And
no, it isn't.
We'll get there. We'll get there. But I'm saying the view of how these people may view it. The country is a bit of a precipice because if you say went ANC, MK, EFF, we're going to get into the permutations now. But if you went that way, we very much might go down the route of nationalizing things. So the MK has as their first priority to nationalize major assets in the country. Those include banks and mines. Now, that's a left-wing policy. That is not a right-wing policy. It's never been a right-wing policy. You will not find a right-wing government that does that because fundamentally, being right-wing, you have to respect private property rights. And being left-wing, you are more into collectivism. I just found it very interesting, the kind of protectionism that went up. For me, it was being protective. It was saying, if this turns pear-shaped and everything goes south and we nationalize banks and mines 3 months from now, then we just want everyone to know that this is a right-wing government. We want you to be stupid enough to think that nationalizing things is right-wing. Anyway, I just found that quite odd. It was a bit of an oddity on social media yesterday. And I'm sure it's going to be a talking point going forward. I'm sure we're going to be hearing again and again and again how MK is right-wing, which will be hilarious when a right-winger eventually does come around because, the further left we go, the more inevitable that becomes. It'll be hilarious for how they deal with that because if MK is practicing Marxism and is on the right, man, are they going to be upset if anyone who plays rock and likes a chainsaw and reads a lot of Mazis comes along. So I just felt I needed to add that in. But we can get to where you want to go, which is
where?
which is the numbers, right? So
No, it's not about the numbers. It's so the numbers actually don't matter at this stage. So I'll tell you why they don't matter. Because there's only two directions we can really go realistically at this point.
Yeah.
It's either going to be ANC-DA or it's going to be ANC-MK.
Good.
Okay. So you could look at a scenario where it's DA plus MK plus, all of the rats and mice parties. It's going to be damn near impossible. It's like herding cats.
Yeah, we've just done the maths. Before we started the show, we had a look at all the seat numbers. You need 201 seats for a majority.
Correct.
Or you would need 201 people to vote, or abstentions whereby the actual number of votes cast would still equal 50 plus 1.
Correct.
Okay. For president, that's how so you could have 300 people abstain, but of the 100 who actually vote, 51 vote for the president. That would still count.
Correct.
Okay. But we've worked it out. And if you wanted an actual coalition government, DA plus MK plus everyone else except for the ANC and EFF doesn't equal 200. We're assuming that the PAC is not going along with this and ATM and whatever.
Correct.
But it's still, I still think you fall a few seats short.
Yes.
So realistically, even though I quite like the idea of a DA-MK coalition, and I'll explain why a little bit
I like
later.
the idea for DA-MK coalition as well.
What's your reasoning?
But we're not going to get there.
Okay, let's do the hypotheticals. What's your reasoning behind that? Because I think a lot of people would be listening and being like, "Are you people actually out of your minds? Why on earth would the DA ever consider going into a coalition with the MK? I've been told by all of mainstream media, Zuma is Putin's puppet, and he's a terrible man, and Cyril is upstanding, and he goes on walks on the pier in Sea Point, and really
he speaks such beautiful English.
Yes, the old he's so articulate trope, right? So why is it that actually DA-MK, if it could happen, might not be a terrible thing?
Simply because of the fact that Helen Zille is on record as saying that she can work with Jacob Zuma.
I'll give you more reasons. Over and above that is in that partnership, the DA and the MK, the DA is the leading partner in terms of percentage. So we'll get to what happens with the DA-ANC coalition, but the ANC still gets to say, we're bringing in 40%, folks. You're bringing in 20. Like, there's a power imbalance here. Even if we're going to split the government, you're going to get a third of it. We're going to get 2/3, even if we're splitting it down.
But can we agree that in that scenario, a disproportionate amount of power goes to the smaller party? Because
because they're the kingmaker, right? So, but this is what I want to point to, which is I battle to think of a coalition either locally or globally, where the minority partner, even if they were kingmaker, ultimately grows and becomes more successful after a coalition with the larger partner. So in South Africa, the example would be the Independent Democrats and the DA. The Independent Democrats no longer exist, and what's left of them just got one seat in Parliament. Okay, in the form of good. In the UK, we had that government between the Labour and the Lib Dems, and Lib Dems basically completely collapsed, haven't existed for more than a decade. They may come back in now, actually, as it happens. But I'm very worried that a DA-ANC coalition, because the DA is the smaller partner, actually will erode DA support. And so while we might buy stability for 5 years, thereafter I worry. Because if the DA disappears, what you really have, the DA is the only thing. I know there are going to be arguments, they're not, they're left-wing, they're right-wing, they're centrist. Guys, compared to the ANC, the EFF, and the MK, the DA is undoubtedly to the right of those parties. And the only other other parties I can consider to the right of that position of the DA would be something like the Freedom Front Plus, which shrunk, something like the ACDP, which also shrunk. Okay.
So can we take this view?
Yes.
Can we agree that if the DA has a significant influence in terms of the national government over the next 5 years, there's going to be a number of things that will immediately work better? So we can say without hesitation that the economy will work better, safety and security will work better, health would probably work better, and education will work better. And if you stretch that out over a 5-year period, the knock-on impact of that immediately is going to be an increase in the size of the middle class.
Yes.
And when I say an increase in the size of the middle class, it means that there will be significantly more black people in the middle class.
Correct.
Which immediately means that the DA is going to be growing its own base.
Okay, that's an interesting argument.
So I think that that's a crucial thing for us to
You
keep in
don't
mind.
think that perhaps a lot of those people would look at, and a lot of people who abandoned the ANC this time might look at it and say, well, the DA and the ANC went into coalition.
No, I'm
the
saying
ANC's been in charge.
people didn't abandon the ANC. People moved to other factions of the ANC. Let's be very clear about that. Because overall, if you look in terms of the numbers,
Yeah,
the DA hasn't really grown. It's grown by 1 percentage point.
yeah. 3 seats in Parliament.
But that's on the back of a reduced turnout. If you look in terms of the sheer number of votes the DA got, 2019 versus 2024, the DA is down in terms of numbers.
Yeah, but turnout was lower.
Yes,
So
yeah. So
they ended up with more seats in Parliament.
yes, but they ended up with more seats in Parliament because of the fact that they have a 1 percentage point increase in terms of their base.
the vote share.
Yeah, but at the same time, take the view that the ANC has been pretty much in exactly the same boat. In fact, the only party that's actually grown its base just in terms of vote numbers was the IFP. And of course, there's MK, which comes from nowhere, but MK is essentially cannibalizing votes that came primarily from the ANC and then from the EFF.
So on that point, just as another hypothetical, if the MK didn't exist, where do you think the IFP might have ended up?
I think the IFP would have been significantly higher than they are.
Yeah.
And but again, that's a difficult question to ask because by the same token, one must ask, would the IFP have performed significantly better if Buthelezi was still alive? The answer to that is yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. So, which is another point that we need to come to. But I'd like us to step back for a bit because right now we're spending too much time on the numbers, and it's no longer about the numbers.
Okay.
Okay.
Good. So we've said DA-MK can't happen.
Yeah, we said DA-MK can't happen.
So what can happen?
So what can happen? The two immediate things that can happen is you can have ANC-DA or you can have ANC-MK. Because the ANC, coupled with either the DA or MK, get pushed to 200 seats plus 1, which is what they need to control Parliament. So if you've got those either of those scenarios, that's a government that cannot be challenged by the rest of the parties. Now we have to step back and say, what does MK bring to the party that you and I might like? And what does the DA bring to the party that you and I might like? So let me start off with the devil's advocate thing and the things that MK would do that I would like. Okay. So MK is going to go hell for leather in terms of getting nuclear power plants in.
All right.
Okay. They'll probably be Russian built, but MK will do that. And I think that's great because the single biggest thing that can contribute to the bottom line in the country is going to be cheap power. MK is also going to frack the hell out of the Karoo.
Yeah, I like it.
Okay.
I do like it.
The single biggest cost right now that we incur is the fact that this country consumes 500,000 barrels of oil per day just to keep the economy ticking over. And currently we're paying for that oil in US dollars, and that's money that just flows out of the country. And if we are actually exploiting all of the stuff that's available to exploit offshore in the Karoo, we immediately eliminating that.
The Orange Basin as well. There's a whole
Yeah,
bunch of...
absolutely.
We've got tons of gas and oil in this country.
So if you just simply take a view at that level, okay, are we going to have a potential collapse in the rand-dollar exchange rate based on the fact that MK is in power? Yes. Would that be more than offset by the fact that we are no longer needing to spend money on acquiring fuel from outside the country, and that money is actually being spent on developing the economy locally and building jobs locally? The answer to that is yes.
Sure. I must just say that I'm not sure I buy that in terms that it would cancel each other out. So I hear your points around they would go for nuclear. and that maybe they would go down the oil and gas route, which I would be very keen on. I think every party should be pushing oil and gas.
Well,
but I'm not sure.
Wait. Whether
Because they're going to do other things as well.
Park the skepticism for now, okay? Because remember what I'm trying to do is to hone in on
you
what.
You only want to give me pros.
No. So right now I'm looking at what do I see as the strengths coming from each particular section. Okay.
SWOT analysis.
Yeah. All right. So let's now put the MK aside. There's lots more I could talk about in terms of MK, but just simply in terms of addressing the energy question, which to me is one of the most fundamental pillars of the economy, MK, I believe, would be good for the country at that level. So we're parking the questions around nationalizing the banks and all of that for now. Okay, let's just look at the energy question and put that onto the side. Now let's look at what the DA brings to the party. Okay, we know that the DA is very good administratively. We know that the DA is very good at clean governance.
Yep.
Okay, we know that almost everything that the DA runs in the Western Cape, they do better than the ANC has done in the rest of the country for 30 years. Mm-hmm. Okay, so going back to the points we were talking about earlier, if the DA has control of safety and security, as an example, and we're immediately able to have a highly competent police force in the country, the knock-on effect of that in terms of the bottom line for the economy is huge, because the cost of violent crime on this economy is absolutely massive. So if you're removing that extractive part from the economy, that's immediately going to impact on the bottom line. If you're immediately going to have an uptick in terms of the quality of education that we've got around the country, that within a 5-year period is going to lead to an uptick in our bottom line. So there are all of these bits and pieces where just simply managing our current economic structure in a non-corrupt and more efficient way will immediately contribute to an uptick in GDP as well.
I feel like I've got Helen Ziller sitting opposite me. This is the capable state argument. And I can I throw a spanner in the works yet, or you want to continue with, this?
So I
painting
think
the picture.
No. So the first thing that I think that we need people to get their heads around is that both of these coalitions, in different ways, will have a good impact on the economy. Okay, there are negative impacts as well, which we could talk about at some length. But as the broad brushstrokes, okay, if you're eliminating ANC corruption, putting in place solid safety and security measures, and is that going to lead to an immediate uptick in terms of the GDP? Yes.
Sure.
If you bring in practically unlimited cheap energy that we're plucking out from the ground, is that going to lead to an uptick in the economy? Yes. So this is why I say that there should not be a sense of panic in terms of the overall economic well-being of the country in either direction. So now that we've got those two pieces out, that's when we need to start thinking about which is better for the country in the long term. And that's the more crucial part. Because the thing that we do know in terms of the DA is they're not going to frack the country. They are not going to exploit the offshore oil. They are going to get us more deeply into debt in terms of getting massive solar farms around the country.
Which will fail ultimately.
Which will ultimately fail. And if you look in terms of the...
As will wind farms.
If you look in terms of the energy ROI, it's very clear that nuclear has the best energy return on investment, and wind and solar have the lowest in terms of longevity. If you
look, wind and solar, just as an aside, at the moment are basically pump and dump schemes.
Yes.
So essentially, rich people are putting their money into development of solar and wind, and governments are funding and paying for that, taking loans, all the rest of it. Those people are then earning, very well off of investing in those projects. Once those projects are developed, they run away. And when the solar panels, one hailstorm takes out your entire solar farm, or your wind turbines catch fire from the oil that's inside the turbine, or whatever it is, those people are long gone, and unfortunately you've got unreliable energy. So I hear those points. I mean, where do we know? do we know that MK is really big into, for example, oil and gas? Why are you saying that? Where's that coming from?
I'm
I
saying
think the
that
nuclear is a thing because we know Zuma tried to do the nuclear.
Yeah.
But where's the oil and gas? He never
So,
tried for that.
I think there's a lot of people who accuse Zuma of being in the pocket of the Russians and funded by the Russians. I think there's a very strong possibility that that's true. Yeah, but if you take the view that Zuma's point of influence is coming from Putin, let's be very clear that those are particular strengths that the Russians have. So if you take a look in terms of how the Russians were able to shrug off
All the sanctions.
all of the sanctions, okay, it basically came down to two things. The one is that they are largely self-sufficient in almost everything that we need to survive as a species. And they are energy independent. Now, if you look at, in terms of South Africa during the apartheid years, at the point at which the hell was sanctioned out of the apartheid government, they very quickly built a very solid, resilient base. And if you look in terms of all of the innovations that emerged from South Africa at the time under apartheid, they were able to close off the economy, build a solid, productive base in the country, with the sole exception of oil. So they had to resort to doing things like hijacking tankers and bringing them into Durban, emptying the oil, then taking them back out to sea, and then the tanker mysteriously sinks. But guess what? There's no oil spillage whatsoever that happens. You've got to give credit to them for being able to pull off that type of stuff. Now, if you take a view in terms of the South African economy and the way in which we engage with the rest of the world, now, I think you know that I'm a fan of a free market and I'm a fan of people being able to trade freely with each other.
Yeah.
We must also take a view that we can't possibly have free trade between South Africa and China. Now, let me say why that's the case. It's because the playing field is not level. So if we are producing, let's say, the textile industry in our country, where we have very strong labor laws, where we have minimum wage laws, we have collective bargaining agreements that apply across the sector. So we effectively end up hiring people who are working for $2 an hour versus the Chinese who are paying people $2 a day. And there is no way that we can trade freely just simply in terms of textiles based on the fact that it's not a level playing field because the Chinese are always going to be able to outcompete us.
Okay.
Now, if we have a closed-off economy and we are largely self-sufficient, what do we need trade for?
Well, can you be a closed-off economy in this day and age? Who is?
Well, Russia.
Russia has China.
Russia has China and Russia has Iran, but on very specific things. But again, you need to ask yourself, what are the things that Russia is currently doing in terms of its relationship with China that is absolutely essential to its survival in the short term? Right now, the reason why those two are working as closely together as they are is because they are united against a common enemy, which is the collective West. Mm-hmm. But do they actually need each other at a fundamental economic level? Probably China to a larger extent than Russia needs China because of the fact that
China needs Russia.
China needs Russia to a larger extent simply because of energy.
Okay.
Because that's the single commodity that flows, and it's primarily in one direction. And the Russians take it back in other means. So, Chinese vehicles are now widespread in Russia, but I think the fundamental point that we need to get to is and this is where the EFF, they've always cottoned on to this because they've understood that if the Nats were able to do it successfully during the apartheid era by basically cutting ties with the rest of the world, and of course there's going to be a range of people now who are going to be saying that I'm recommending these things. I'm not.
Yeah,
all right.
I mean, I'm waiting for my chance to talk.
Remember right now, I'm not expressing a preference for either of these parts. I'm trying to say, here are scenarios that we need to consider, and that should in fact inform the direction in which the country is going to be going based on which of the scenarios we end up going with. So it's either going to be DA, ANC, or it's going to be MK, ANC.
Yeah.
Right.
So
let me just park that.
You see, I mean, you're talking about broader sort of international relationships and where we fit in terms of the geography and the trade and all of that stuff.
No, what I'm talking about is what is ultimately going to deliver maximum benefit for people on the ground in the shortest possible time. And so the international relations are collateral damage in the grand scheme of things.
Okay, the international relations are collateral damage. You see, I don't see it that way. I mean, I think, even if you refer to the Nats were being able to pull it off, I don't think they were able to pull it off. I mean, the reality is the whole narrative and story that gets told about, it was... the Sharpeville massacre, and that was turned everyone against them, and then because people in 1976. Hold on, I'll get there. But this is the narrative. The narrative is that apartheid ended because you had these seminal events, which I don't take away; they were seminal events, but you had these seminal events, which then led to a whole bunch of people. Well-to-do people in Western countries, essentially, turning around and going, "No more." And they would march in the streets of London and say no more. And because they did that, the Nats turned around, looked at it and went, people in London don't like us. We better give it all up. And that's not what happened at all. And neither is it what happened that there was a wily general in the MK who was causing so much trouble for the Nats that they didn't know what to do with themselves, and they just thought, we can't deal with this Zuma fellow, we're going to give it all up. That's not what happened either. What actually happened is that sanctions were imposed on the country, and they did manage to weather a lot of that, but ultimately it was too difficult and too onerous to weather it all the time for that many years, and they looked at it and said, this is not sustainable in the end. And this is well documented, the fact that they looked at the sustainability of the entire project in terms of apartheid, what it was doing, and in terms of how it was affecting the country from an external perspective.
I agree with you 100%. Now, but take this view.
Yes.
Okay. The only reason why it was unsustainable is because it was excluding the majority of the populace of the country. Now, we have an entirely different scenario now, where if you're actually implementing an apartheid-era type isolationism, for want of a better word, and where you're actually taking the entire populace with you, it's an entirely different scenario. Then it becomes a Russian-type scenario. So I'm just saying park that. And I don't want us to get bogged down by the minutiae in terms of what led to the collapse of apartheid.
No,
that's an entire that's an entire rabbit hole that we could go down.
But what I'm trying to say to you is that saying that we can operate in isolation, especially given the world we live in now, and I'm not making a globalist argument, I'm making an argument for being nationalists to the point that you do what is best for your country and the people in it, but understanding that the world has changed in terms of how things are done. So, for instance, supply chains were not a thing in the 50s, 60s, 70s. You bought stuff from one country. All your stuff, if you wanted certain things, electronics came from Germany, then Japan. Cars came from the United Kingdom and Germany, and then Japan. There wasn't this case of, well, we build a car in South Africa, the metal, the steel of which comes from that country over there, the wiring harness which comes from that country over there, etc. There is an element of globalism that you cannot avoid. And if you try to avoid it, I'm sure you could, but I think everyone in the country ends up worse off, not better off, by doing that. So I hear your point around MK and which way we go, or DA, ANC, MK, DA, ANC, and we should be calling it ANC, DA, because it's always going to be ANC and then the other partner. But the reality is I think there's a lot of other considerations, because not just the one thing they might do. So we agree that the DA would probably manage things better. That's what they are. They're a managerial party. They like to come in and they like to look at graphs and they like to do certain things. I don't actually think that they'd actually be good at safety and security. And why don't I think that? Because the DA likes to follow rules. And so if you said to the DA, the reason why there's still violence in the Cape Flats, the reason why the situation in the Cape Flats has essentially not changed over 20 years, regardless of whether the ANC were in charge, and they were 20 years ago, or the DA has been in charge for the last 15 or so. The reason why that situation hasn't changed is because the DA is never willing to go as far as it needs to go. So the DA always looks at the Constitution and defers to the most conservative possible interpretation thereof. Okay? And in our Constitution, if it sort of seems to say that criminals have rights, the DA will embrace that. Instead of saying the rights of the criminals do not supersede the rights of ordinary non-criminal citizens. And so I'm going to behave like Nayib Bukele, for example. The DA will never do that. All right? I don't believe any other party will either.
Well, MK might.
They have no track record for that, in my view. But so, but at the same time,
I'll give you an example of when there was a track record of that. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I'll use the very specific example of the NMBT district in KZN, which is better known to most of us as Ladysmith, and which was a place where basically factionism was tearing the place apart. And it was IFP versus NFP versus ANC. And Zuma basically dispatched Behicele down there with a very specific message. And the message, he called all of these guys together in the one room. And he said, you guys are going to stop this killing each other, because if you do not stop it, we will come in and we will kill you. Very specifically, that's what happened. And then you had a period of peace in that district up until the time that Zuma was ousted, and then the killing started again. There have been these periods where you actually needed that strong arm tactic. Look, let's take this view in terms of the DA. I agree with you that they bend over in the direction of the Constitution. And frankly, I think that that's a good thing to do. Because the situation that we have right now, where there's a shoot-to-kill policy that's being adopted in many parts of the country, to me is as scary as the alternative of just being the rampant lawlessness that has continued for a while. What we can agree upon is that with the DA running safety and security, they will follow the money trail. And you will end up with a situation where the people who actually control the purse strings, which ultimately leads to the criminality on the ground, are more likely to be prosecuted.
I think that's correct.
Than the current situation.
Yes, I would
so
agree with that.
We should not look at safety and security as having more police on the streets. It really is about ensuring, for example, that you're protecting all of the dockets that are drawn up. We had that discussion in terms of blockchain protecting the audit trail on the documents, so that they don't get lost.
Blockchain to the DA and they think it's crypto, and then they tell you that it's a scam.
But I think that there are enough smart people in the DA to actually understand how to end up digitally securing documents, and that'll make a huge difference. So I'd like to then,
I want to just get into the MK, because I made the argument against the DA side, and I want to make the argument. I mean, I am the biggest proponent of oil and gas exploration in this country. Sure. I have been for years, and I have disagreed with every time there's a campaign to stop this. 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago now, 2012 I think it was, there was attempts to start fracking in the Karoo. and basically a whole bunch of people who said the Karoo's going to be destroyed.
It was blocked by the courts.
Yeah, well,
Because of the NGOs, yeah.
Exactly. The courts are not an island. The courts are reacting to public opinion. The courts are reacting to who's bringing the cases. The courts are reacting to the arguments, etc. And it's not as if there's no manipulation happening here. The reality is that we should have started fracking then. The Karoo will now be destroyed, but it will be destroyed by solar panels. And that is what's going to happen to your beloved Karoo. So you could have had fracking, which you can't even see. If you go more than a kilometer from the well, you wouldn't even know they were fracking there. And with that, all those towns in the Karoo that all the people are poor and have no food and anything, all those people would have been employed. Those towns would be buzzing.
Okay, so you and I are both in agreement that
100%.
fracking is good. Yeah.
So fine.
But now
they should have done fracking. They should have done the exploration off the coast as well. That Shell was going to kill a few whales.
Bad things about MK, which is where we.
Yeah. So the thing is even if MK went straight down that road and said we're going to go heavy into oil and gas, and we don't care. My problem is if you go heavy into oil and gas, but you also simultaneously do things like, because they haven't said they want to go into oil and gas, but they have said they want to nationalize the banks. So
let's talk about nationalizing the banks. What does it mean?
It means making the...
No, just explain to me in practical terms.
Government owns the banks.
Which means what for the government?
Which means government has complete and control. Firstly, complete control over those banks. They might still have their names, but at the end of the day, the decisions that get made about where that capital gets put, how that capital is invested, who gets access to that capital, all of those decisions are made by the government. And so, let me give you the example of COVID funds. They say 500 billion was stolen. I estimate it's closer to 2 trillion that was stolen during COVID. And the reality is it's the same thing. What you're saying is you're giving people who we know are thieves, right? You're giving them, and it will be the ANC and MK. So you've got two parties where there's rampant corruption. And you're saying to both of them, listen, here are the skeleton keys to the entire combined bank account of Standard Bank, First National, Nedbank, etc., Absa, go wild. And so the idea that they would preserve those funds or spend them appropriately, I don't buy that. And even if you wanted to invest in oil and gas, you have to have an environment where investments can take place. And that environment includes funding. Right now, as it happens in South Africa, we have the environment to invest in all of these things. It's the reason why go to your bank's website. Doesn't matter who you bank with. Go to your bank's website, and I guarantee you, within 3 clicks, you can find a picture of a solar panel or a windmill. And the reason for that is because they're all burning your money this exact horse shit.
Yes, but you're getting sucked into that that trope again. So remember the question that I asked.
Yes.
Given the scenario that you've just described,
yes,
you're not showing me what the immediate benefit is to nationalizing the banks.
Me, there's no benefit. Do you think there's a benefit?
No, I don't think that. So from MK's point of view, what is the benefit going to be to them actually nationalizing the banks?
Access to money.
Because one of the things that we're very clear about is that access to money has never been a problem in South Africa. What has been a problem is access to money in a way that actually ends up benefiting the economy in the long term.
Yeah.
And we know this simply because of the fact that the JSE's top 40 are sitting on mounds of cash, and they're not deploying it anywhere. Why are they not doing it? Well, for exactly the same way that Apple and Google are not currently deploying their mounds of cash, because of the fact that the opportunities to actually invest it in a place that makes sense, it's going to guarantee a proper return.
But Kanthan, in a ANC MK coalition where the rand is instantaneously 30-1 and probably drops by 10% every 2 to 3 months.
Yes.
Do you really believe that those companies then go, you know what, now's the opportunity to invest our cash in this country? Or any foreign direct investor goes, now's the opportunity to invest in this country? I mean, that's my problem.
I'm saying that at that particular point, they have no other alternative.
All right, but that is. I mean, that sounds like we're putting them in a sort of position of desperation. Use your cash or lose it. Essentially, is what you say.
Essentially what it
Because
is, yeah.
because if you don't invest it in an asset, it's just cash, and the cash is ever dwindling in terms of its value because inflation would be through the roof.
So one of the reasons why people don't invest their cash currently is because there are too many obstacles in place to getting a return on that investment. Okay, and we know what the obstacles are. So BE is a huge obstacle because it means you're immediately giving away a significant percentage of your business with no return. That's coming back in your direction. Our labor laws are a huge obstacle in terms of trying to turn a profit. Just the sheer complexity of the cost of doing business in the country means that it's far better, particularly with the high interest rates that we've got right now, to just leave your money sitting in the bank, and which means at least that you end up with a kind of break-even scenario.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah. So the question right now, remember that we started off with what do they stand to gain by nationalizing the banks? I'm saying that in the short term, they have no need to do that. More to the point, in order for them to get to the stage where they're able to do that, they need to hit that 2/3 point and persuade sufficient people that they need to do that.
Need and want, though, are very different.
And so remember that right now, that with the current makeup of the ANC, previously it was ANC and EFF, and currently now it's ANC and MK and EFF. Were they able to hit a 2/3 majority and to actually be able to turn things around in a direction that would have been acceptable to all of them? No. So, I mean, why do the EFF and the ANC differ on expropriation without compensation? Well, legalized theft, as it is, but they differ on that because they have very clear, distinct understandings about the fact that they work very differently to the way in which they think it does.
I think you're giving a lot of credit to MK in terms of their ability to understand what their actions would do. So the reason I believe the ANC hasn't gone ahead with expropriation without compensation, even though they've passed law that would make it perfectly legal for them to do so, the reason I think they haven't done that is because there are enough people in the ANC who understand what the effects would be.
So who are those people?
So I'll give you an example. One example, I mean, he's not there at the moment anymore, but Tito Mboweni is definitely one of them. The reason NHI didn't happen up until now was because certainly while Tito Mboweni was in the ANC and in Treasury and anywhere involved in finance, every time NHI came up in the ANC circles, or any time it was brought to him at Treasury and he was told to fund it, he turned around and said no. He said, this is not viable. We do not have the funds to do this. It is not possible. So it doesn't matter whether you like this as a policy, whether you want to do this. The reality is that it cannot be done. And if we try to force the square peg through the round hole, we will cause more damage than it is worth. Now, I'm not a big fan of lots of these people, but I think, for example, the DA-ANC that is currently meeting in rooms and making deals to potentially have a minority coalition, because that's what it looks like we're going to end up with. That group of people understands what it means to go from 18 Rand to the dollar to 30. They have some fundamental understanding. And they understand that it may not only have an effect on poor people or people they don't give a shit about, but it may actually directly have an effect on them.
So I'll refer you to a previous conversation that you and I had in a different context, which was my assertion that for 80% of the populace of the country, whether it is 18 Rand to the dollar or whether it is 100 Rand to the dollar, it doesn't make a difference in their lives. For 80% of the populace of this country.
Yeah, we disagreed on this. Because you're trying to
fully aware.
You're trying to squeeze Pareto principle into something.
And I'm saying that certainly in terms of you and me being part of the 20%, the idea of 30 rand to the dollar is going to be incredibly hard to bear. Let's be very clear about that. And would I prefer a situation where we have a ANC-DA coalition that's able to stabilize the currency, claw back some of that value, and generally make it affordable for me to be able to travel around the world, as I'm very fond of doing? I think the answer to that absolutely is yes. Remember, what we're talking about, though, is not what my preference is going to be around where it should be going. It's a question of what are the political perspectives that these players have? And more crucially now, which of those perspectives is more likely to appeal to the ANC? So right now, the DA has to persuade the ANC members that are left behind in Parliament. But also, it's not just the ANC members who are left behind in Parliament. Their continued existence depends on them being able to persuade people at the next consultative conference that they are doing the right thing that's in the interests of the ANC. And that's going to be a much harder thing to sell. Is MK more likely to be able to persuade the ANC and its support base primarily that they are far better off throwing in their lot with MK than they are with the DA? I think that there's a strong argument to be made for that. So it's not a question of what I prefer.
No, I'm not talking about what I prefer. I mean, I disagree with your 80-20 because firstly, I don't think it's 80-20. Just let's start there. It's a nice idea to use Pareto for this concept because it's an easily understandable
I think I should drop that particular thing
you
from.
You should, but you should also drop the 80-20 because it doesn't apply as 80-20.
It doesn't help us take our discussion any further.
No.
I'm saying that for a majority of the populace of the country.
51%.
Yes, 50 plus 1%.
And I would fundamentally disagree. And I'll just state my position on why I disagree with that is because actually if the Rand goes to 30 to 1, I will feel uncomfortable and it means I will travel overseas less often. Okay?
Yes.
It also means I will buy certain goods less often. It also means I might downgrade my car. It also means my savings will decrease. It means things like that. But I'll probably be okay. Why? Well, because I'm in the middle class and I fortunately have a job that will continue regardless of that, at least for now. And so as a result, I'll be able to weather that storm. That majority you speak of. So let's talk about 30 to the dollar, what that means, because we're about 18. So it's basically the Rand halving, all right? It's almost halving. It's 40% loss. What that would mean is that the average taxi fare would increase by 40 to 50%.
No, but you're talking middle class again.
Okay, hold on.
Because people who are taking taxis are middle class. Okay. They're not part of the 80%.
All right. So this is where you hold on. People who buy food, which is everyone, food would go up by 40%. So what that means for the middle class, and I'm not talking about people who take taxis necessarily.
It's devastating for the middle class. But remember, people who take taxis, they're effectively middle class. Let's be very clear about
hilarious.
that.
In what world are people,
because
the majority of people taking taxis middle class?
Okay, because if you consider, again, the fact that anyone who's currently employed is effectively middle class.
Sure.
Can we take that view?
No, we can't take that view. But okay, I'll let you run with it. But I'm disagreeing.
I'm running with it because you have people with zero income, zero property, who live in predominantly rural areas and have lived that way and continue to live that way. And it's largely subsistence based.
So I think this argument becomes a much, much more convincing argument if it's presented in that way. Neither as a majority nor minority, but rather as a rural versus urban population. Then it's a more convincing argument. What I am saying is that everybody buys bread, even people in rural areas who are subsistence farming, etc. They buy bread, they buy that kind of stuff, bread, milk, eggs. Although, yes, they may very well be picking that up off farms and things around them and have goats, etc., which may provide milk, etc. The point I'm making is that when bread increases by 50%, I'll notice it, but I'll be okay. So will most of what most people would consider the middle class. Someone who's able to maybe afford to buy a property, even if it's a very small one. Someone who might be saving up for a car or have one. That's, I think, what most people would consider the middle class. And those people will see the difference, but will probably still be able to stomach it. The people who are battling to afford to buy a loaf of bread now, those people stop being able to afford that loaf of bread. And then what happens, and this is historically what happens in other countries that make bad decisions, is bad decisions beget bad decisions. So you get an ANC and MK government, the rand halves its value, and maybe for no reason. I mean, there are lots of people online who don't understand economics, who say, we don't care about foreign investment and we don't care about markets. And unfortunately, that's not how the world works. You don't get to not care about those things. But the rand halves its value, and what then happens is you now have an increased level of the population in utter distress. And so what governments often do to resolve that is they start doing more radical things. So if you're an ANC MK government, that's the point at which you nationalize the banks.
But
so
you see what you're doing is you are starting from a false premise, and then you're extrapolating on the false premise.
What's the false premise?
And the false premise is that you are saying that things are going to get that much worse if it's 30 to the dollar. And again, I'm saying that that's not necessarily going to be the case. Now, let me tell you at a very specific level, using the example you brought up, which is what happens if the cost of transportation ends up going through the roof. And it goes back to an exercise that
bread's
I did.
My main example, but bread's my main example.
Yes, but the cost of bread goes up as a direct result of the cost of transportation. Because remember that we're producing the raw materials within the country. So the cost of maize and the cost of wheat is not going up by itself. The overall impact, almost everything that has occurred at an inflationary level in this country, directly ties into the cost of energy. Let's be very clear about that. The reason why your prices have been going through the roof, particularly in terms of woolies and in terms of checkers and so forth, is the cost of the cold chain goes up exactly by the cost of the price of fuel. Cost of transportation goes up by exactly the same level. Is it costing us more in terms of actually growing the wheat? No, because the overall price that is being paid to the farmers has not changed. You're still paying, so the farmer is still getting the same amount of money per liter of milk that they've been getting for like the past 20 years. But the costs that are associated with that go through the entire chain. The exercise that I did more than a year ago was when I did a comparison around what would happen if we had to cut loose from AGOA and we bought oil from Russia on the same terms that India is buying oil from Russia. And remember, India buys oil from Russia at a substantial discount to the international price of crude oil, which this morning was sitting at around about 80 to the barrel. Mm-hmm. Remember, Russia bases its entire budget on crude oil being sold at roughly 40 US. Okay, so everything that they make over and above that is just gravy for them. They just end up banking that. And if we end up with a situation where we are getting a substantial discount on the price of oil because of Zuma's friendship with Putin, is there going to be an overall beneficial effect on our bottom line? I'm saying the answer to that is yes. Now, once again, I want to be very clear. That's not the direction I want the country to go in. But I'm saying that these are the considerations that both sides need to be taking into account when they are having their overall discussions. And I'm saying that those discussions are being had because anyone who assumes that Jacob Zuma doesn't know what he's talking about, they've been proven wrong time and again.
Sure.
The guy is flippin' smart. He's the fact that his education was cut short when he was in primary school doesn't mean that he actually lacks the overall understanding to be able to hold his own. Now, so let's park the national question for a while. What I think is, but here's where I think it is going to end up. And And it's possibly also where I hope it's going to end up. I hope it's going to end up with an ANC-DA coalition. Okay, because it's the least painful route for us as a country, and in the short term, it's going to see an immediate beneficial effect on the bottom line
I agree.
for the middle class in particular, and there is going to be an overall impact that betters the lives of people in the rural areas as well, because we have this thing called black tax, where money does filter through from the urban areas through to the rural areas. If we end up going the Jacob Zuma route, trust me, there's going to be an onslaught from the globalists on this country, the likes of which we have never seen before. And will there be an attempt to push us into a Venezuela-type scenario? Absolutely.
Let me just ask you that then. You said push us into Venezuela.
Sure.
So Venezuela didn't do it to themselves, and Zimbabwe didn't do it to themselves. No. I'm just trying to understand.
I'm saying that they didn't. So let's be very clear in the case of let's use Zimbabwe as
sure. Let's use Zimbabwe. It's more relevant to us.
Yeah. Okay. So the overall impact on the Zimbabwean economy in terms of sanctions has been devastating. Why was it that way? Because of the very simple reason that in order to buy oil, you need access to dollars. And why? Because of the fact that every war that the U.S. has fought over the past 50 years, shall we say, has been to ensure its hegemony in only being able to buy oil using U.S. dollars. And at the point that anyone tried to step out of line, they were immediately sanctioned and regime changed. So Zimbabwe, had it not been for the fact that it was not able to freely obtain foreign currency based on the fact that it had been sanctioned, their economy would be in a significantly better shape. And more to the point, South Africa would have been in a significantly better shape based on the fact that we wouldn't have had all of these people flocking across the border into our country, because it's the only way that they've been able to hold things together.
There was a guy who made a decision, dude. I mean, there's a guy in charge, in power. Nobody forced his hand to say to his war veterans, who most of whom were in their 20s at the time, but nobody forced his hand to say, I'd like you to go take whichever farm you like, and basically kick all the people in our single biggest industry.
Let me draw a corollary between this scenario and the Israel scenario. And the question is where you start asking the questions. So you use the example now of people who are picking on Netanyahu, and they say, no, this did not start on October 7th. And then, people then go back and point out that, to the historical Jewish kingdoms that existed way before any concept of the modern international states actually existed. It's a question of where you draw your line in the sand. And if I use Zimbabwe as a very specific example, the Lancaster House Agreement was very clear that if there was going to be expropriation, then the British would cover the costs of the expropriation.
Sure.
So,
and you've said this before.
And so my point is that when you had Mugabe calling upon the British to honor their side of the deal, and Tony Blair said, no, we're not going to do it, that's the point at which he actually breaks the agreement, because he has made a promise.
Sure, he broke the agreement and destroyed his country.
No, he didn't break the agreement. The agreement was broken by the British by refusing to pay.
But then you turn around and go, okay, instead of me then proceeding anyway, because screw the British, I'm going to do it regardless of whether there's funding for it or not. Right, which is a dumb concept anyway. The idea that you're going to fund expropriation without compensation so that you can let me use
it was expropriation with compensation. That was the point.
Expropriation with it's still a dumb idea, because Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of the continent.
Now once again you're confusing issues. Whether it's a dumb idea or not is not what we're debating. What we are debating is what got it into that situation. Now, let's take a view in terms of Venezuela as well.
Hold on, I don't want to leave Zimbabwe. I want to finish on this point, because it's true that if the British are saying we will fund the expropriation with compensation, and then they say we're not going to do it anymore, there's still a choice on the part of Mugabe for whether he goes ahead regardless and does it without compensation, which is what he did.
Yes.
And he made that choice. He looked at it and said, I don't care whatever the consequences may be. And I'm also going to take my single biggest industry, the thing that keeps my country ticking, and I'm happy to destroy that overnight. Now, you can make the argument that, well, the British were ultimately responsible for that because Mugabe would never have made the decision if the British hadn't have broken their contract. Maybe that's true. Maybe you can blame the British for it. The bottom line is that doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change that it was a terrible idea. It doesn't change that he could have stopped it. He could have chosen not to do that. He didn't have to, or did he have to?
So once again, you're heading down a path which was not the source of our original discussion.
Yeah.
Because, the question of whether they were right or wrong, I'm trying to deal with objective realities as they exist and what happened at particular points in history. Because let's be very clear that at any particular point in history, that happens to be a pivotal moment. So we're in a pivotal moment in our country now.
The premise was that Zimbabwe is screwed because they were unable to buy fuel because they were unable to access dollars. Is that correct?
Not only fuel, but almost everything that they need access to.
They were
from
unable
the rest
to
of the
access dollars, and that was really what caused it. And I'm saying before they were unable to access dollars, a man who was in charge of the entire country had to make a bad decision, which we can objectively say was a bad decision because Zimbabwe was objectively a better place for everyone in it before he made that decision. So what I'm saying is, in the South African context, is we may have an onslaught by globalists. I don't necessarily disagree with that. And they may cause a lot of trouble in this country. They already have. But we ultimately are the ones who, well, unfortunately not you and I, but we are the ones that are making the decisions. We have people in power who are going to make good or bad decisions that they may know are good decisions or bad decisions at the time or may not, but subsequently will result in negative things. I think as I've stated, that many of those people in those rooms currently know that doing something like nationalizing the mines or the banks or whatever it is would be probably on balance a bad decision. Now, why it would be a bad decision, which is what you're talking about, which is it's maybe not a bad decision, but the bad decision is because of how
you are hoping
others react.
You are hoping that people know that it would be a bad decision. My view on this is, are there people in those rooms who know that it will be a bad decision? And I use that in air quotes.
Well, there's plenty who don't.
No.
There's plenty who ideologically don't believe that.
I'm disagreeing. You see, what I'm saying is that there are people who know that it's going to have those devastating negative impacts on the economy and are still prepared to go down that particular route. And the reason why they're prepared to go that particular route is not necessarily because they're stupid, but because they do have a different way of looking at the direction in which.
I absolutely agree with you.
And it's not as simple as, communism has never worked before because it wasn't done right, and we'll get it right this time. I'm fully aware that those idiots are out there. Mm-hmm. I am saying that this particular crop that you have right now are not necessarily influenced by the same lines of thinking as the commies, but they are influenced by a range of other things. So ethno-nationalism is clearly very strongly at the top of the list. A complete loathing for the historical colonial masters is another one of the things that still ticks those boxes. But the crucial thing that we need to come back to, over the next week and a half or 2 weeks that it's going to take to pull this together, because we're going to have to get into Parliament and agree to elect a president. And if we cannot get to the stage of electing a president,
We have to go to the vote again.
We have to go to the vote again. Exactly. So, what is likely to happen over the next 2 weeks? And it comes down to one of two things. Whether the DA is able to persuade the ANC that they need to get into a partnership, or whether MK is going to persuade the ANC that they need to get into partnership. MK's conditions for getting into partnership with the ANC is going to be very clear. They want Ramaphosa out. Mm-hmm. If they get Ramaphosa out, will they be able to work with Mashatile? Absolutely, they will work with Mashatile. In which case, Mashatile becomes president, and the country then moves forward with that particular coalition running the country. If the DA is to go on board, it's going to be the DA going on board with Ramaphosa staying in power. What will be necessary for Ramaphosa to stay in power? There's going to be lots of payment that gets made in exactly the same way that happened in Nasrec, where Ramaphosa is able to persuade all of the ANC people who are there and all of the ANC people at the branch structures as well, that there will be enough money in the pipeline so that they don't then stage a revolt that's going to end up in his being recalled. Now, I don't know which of those two is more likely to happen, but I do believe that Ramaphosa's access to funding is significantly better than Zuma's access to funding. And maybe there's a hint of a hope that's being tossed in that direction as well. Because frankly, I'd rather have a scenario where we have an ANC-DA coalition than an ANC-MK
Yeah, I mean,
coalition.
I hate to be rooting for Cyril because, I mean, he's just a useless, ineffectual... He really is terrible. I don't have really good things to say about him.
But you see, now you understand why I tweeted a while back that Deputy President Helen Zille loading.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that.
Yeah.
You said that flippantly, or
No,
you
no.
actually
I
believe
said,
that might be an outcome?
I believe that that's exactly the path that will happen in the event of an ANC-DA coalition going that way.
Why Helen Zille and not John Steenhuisen?
Well, simply because so a lot of it is going to depend on the ability to spin it to the rest of the world. In order to be able to get the collective West to come on board and cheer and support South Africa going forward and promise things like foreign direct investment and so forth, from the globalist point of view, to say South Africa gets a woman deputy president is going to be significant.
Are we doing DEI?
We are doing DEI
as the way we decide the coalition.
No, I'm saying that it's going to be one of the things that particularly the Biden White House is likely to adopt and dance about. Okay, it's also going to show, but also what it means is that from a point of view of each of the sides spinning it to their own teams, they're able to say that each of us is actually taking a hit because the ANC is dropping Mashatile and the DA is dropping Steenhuisen. Having said that, could we have a situation where Steenhuisen ends up being Speaker of Parliament? I think that would be brilliant.
Yeah, he's actually very good he was a very good DA chief whip.
Exactly.
He was excellent in that role.
Would I be very comfortable with Steenhuisen as a Speaker of Parliament? And is that a likely outcome? Well, I'd like to think so. But those are the scenarios that we basically play.
Let's talk about the real scenarios because we've done a lot of theorizing,
Sure.
a lot of argument about hypotheticals, what could be, what might be, and what people might build and nationalize, etc. Let's talk about what seems likely, based on. I'm sure you're hearing some things. I know you have sources in various places, and so do I. Let's talk about what we're hearing because. What I'm hearing is, and this is not particularly secret, this has pretty much gone out on the news wires as well, is that it's likely to be a DA-ANC coalition in which it's not a formal coalition necessarily, or not a formal, fully structured coalition, but more an agreement to support a government that is agreed upon, whoever that may end up being, perhaps Deputy President Helen Zille, and certain key positions, perhaps for certain people, and certain people not in certain key positions. I think that's also going to be an important aspect, and that will be how we move forward. Are you hearing or are you expecting something different?
You see, I think that's all a question of spin, because that gives them the ability to say, well, we're actually not in coalition.
No one sacrificed
anything.
anything.
No one sacrificed anything. No principles were compromised. But ultimately, an agreement of that sort is a coalition, no matter how you end up spinning it. So, which is a very different scenario to what you had in Johannesburg under Mashaba as mayor, where the EFF agreed that they would vote for Mashaba as mayor, but they were not accepting any positions in the council and so forth. I don't think that the way in which you spin it matters. Ultimately, what's going to happen is whether it's ANC-DA or ANC-MK, you are going to have ministerial positions and or parliamentary positions that are going to be awarded to the minority parties.
Which way do you think we're going to go, though?
I don't know yet. This stuff is just too fluid right now. If you look at Ramaphosa on the podium, people said he sounded presidential. People said that he sounded like a man who was acting as a true leader. No, it looked to me like Ramaphosa was defeated, and he was tired of this. He wants to be able to step down and to be able to go on living his life as he sees fit. And that might very well be the case. However, there's a very good reason why he's probably not inclined to go that route. Because if he does go that route, and there's a Mashatile Zuma coalition running the country,
Yeah.
is lawfare going to be instituted against Ramaphosa? Absolutely. They will go after him.
Not only lawfare, but
Everything
they're
around
gonna come after his
COVID
brother-in-law.
the COVID looting,
Motsepe
Pala
is in
Pala,
trouble.
yes, absolutely, all of those things. So the money that's involved right now is huge.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think that that's going to be the decisive factor, and which is why I believe that Ramaphosa is far more likely to pull off a coalition with the ANC, simply because he's going to have access to more money.
Okay, so it comes down to the money.
But isn't that always what it's been?
What's the benefit for the DA?
The benefit for the DA is that the DA will actually get to grow its base.
You'd think so.
I actually absolutely think it will, because what will happen is that people will look at the DA and they will look at the performance of the country over the next 5-year period. Because if the DA is running the country with the ANC and ensuring that it's a clean government, the economy will immediately show improvement.
I mean, that's a lot of ifs. My concern there is that the track record so far outside of the Western Cape is atrocious. The DA has been unsuccessful pretty much everywhere else it has tried.
Well, they haven't been able to get enough of a foothold in order to be able to entrench their position.
with the DA. Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. You see, what I'd be looking at in any coalition. Look, the ANC MK, I wouldn't be looking at shit. I'd kind of resign myself to, when you get to the top of those roller coasters where they tick, 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 all the way to the top, and then you're about to. That's where I would be if it was ANC MK. I'd be like, right, we're at the top of the roller coaster. I have no idea what's over the edge. I don't know if it's a 30-foot drop or a 300-foot drop, but there's going to be a drop, and this is going to be a ride. That's my view on, and I wouldn't really care that much about the minutiae. Maybe for the purposes of this podcast, I might at the time. But the point is that would be less interesting to me. An ANC-DA coalition, the biggest thing I'd actually be interested in would not be Parliament, because I feel as if Parliament is going to be a true democracy. So there's going to be a real split. If they want to put through bang for your buck socialist policy, the EFF, MK, and ANC may very well vote for it. And we may end up with more socialist law, for example. So that's not really of much interest. What's interest to me would be something like an agreement that the DG spots in very key departments are appointed by the DA. That would be of interest. People don't understand how this country operates. They think that the president has a lot of control, and he does as a general concept of direction. But over and above that, in terms of your daily life, Cyril Ramaphosa has no influence into your day-to-day existence. But director generals of departments, ministers as well. Ministers are the people you phone to say, we want to get this law or act through Parliament, or we'd like to take the Department of Health in this particular direction. We want to speak to foreign NGOs or funders or whatever it happens to be, or other governments. That's what the ministers get involved in. They're broad, big plans that happen over years and decades. DGs are chief operations officers, and they decide how that department operates. If you want textbooks to be delivered to all your schools at the beginning of the year, that's the DG making sure that happens properly. If you want to make sure there's syringes in all your hospitals, that's the DG. And so I would hope that, and I think Helen would be smart enough to make this kind of arrangement. I would hope that would be some of the agreement that happens. And if I don't see that, I'd be quite worried that what I'm saying to you with regards to the DA's track record may repeat. Because if the ANC are still in charge of those types of positions, I'll give you a bit of a story. Sorry, I've been speaking for a while now, but as is this podcast, right?
Well, that's the reason why I'm interviewing you.
Yeah,
right?
you're interviewing me. Yeah. On the last YouTube comments, I got told I must keep quiet because you, as the person being interviewed, must be allowed to speak. Pretoria. A lot of people make a lot of noise about Tshwane and that the DA hasn't been as successful as they should have been or claim to have been, etc. And I looked into that quite some time back. And one of the reasons why they had major problems, I don't know if you remember when there was that refuse worker strike, so no garbage was being picked up across the city. And I looked into that. And so the reason behind all of this is that each city has something called a city manager.
Yes.
And the city manager is like the DG of the city.
Correct.
They control
and who's able to allocate
everything. So in other words, if you're going to get a section of road fixed, that doesn't happen without the city manager approving it. If you're going to pay the municipal workers to pick up the rubbish this month, that's the city manager who makes sure that happens. It's an incredibly powerful position. And the city manager is usually appointed. It's a job, and it's appointed by whomever has governed before you, especially if you're coming in as the new
But you
people.
have the ability to remove that person from office.
You do. But again, we've got a DA who follows all the rules.
No. Because remember that one of the first things that Helen Zille did at the point at which she became mayor of Cape Town was she replaced the city manager, which was Wallace Mkoki at the time.
Helen Zille did that.
Yes.
But Cilliers Brink did not.
Well, Cilliers Brink did not because he could not get the rest of his coalition to agree on actually replacing that person. But by the same token, Mashaba did exactly the same stuff up when he was running.
Yes, he did.
Joburg.
And this is the point I'm making. You've got to get the people who ultimately
But to my point,
Helen
actually understands how those things work.
Yes, which is why I say I'm quite
and which is why
hopeful.
I'm also saying that it is going to be Helen in the hot seat, and not because look, Helen probably has got zero interest in getting back into provincial politics or even running a particular department. Okay, does she have an interest in terms of overall overseeing the course of the country? I would say probably yes. And, one can do that in a ceremonial DP role.
Well, remember, she's been talking about a capable state for years.
Yes.
And if you said to Helen, I'm going to give you the opportunity to run a capable state.
Yes.
If we look at a deputy president as basically a prime minister.
Sure.
And the president as the president.
Yeah, my bottom line is, would I rather have Helen Zille running a capable state, or would I rather have Becky Cele running a capable state?
And what's the answer?
The answer is Helen.
Oh,
Absolutely.
okay. I'm just checking.
Absolutely,
I
yes.
don't know where you were going to go with that. Maybe you were going to tell me about Becky's links to Angolan oil or something. I never know with you, Kat. I never know. All right. Anything else what we want to add at this point?
Look, we didn't get a chance to talk about the provinces at all, and I think that's where the
Yes,
really interesting stuff is going to come along.
Have you been looking at some numbers there?
Well, we've been looking at percentages, but remember that the IEC hasn't actually allocated seats yet.
In the MPLs.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So until such time as they've actually done those allocations, then we'll be able. And of course, Gauteng is particularly at the top of my mind because
Yeah, Gauteng. I'm very interested in Gauteng, and I'm also interested in KZN because we've got a situation where I think 44% in KZN is what MK got. So you really have to combine almost everyone else to take it away from them in KZN. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was 44%.
Well, you see, the crucial thing for me in terms of KZN is, are we going to have a situation where MK is able to form a coalition with the IFP? And the answer to that currently is yes.
You think so?
Yes. And more to the point, is this a path that the IFP is likely to take? Again, I think the answer to that is yes, because they actually have a lot in common, those two parties.
Yeah.
Yeah. So MK currently sitting with, so they've now done seat allocation. So MK with 37 seats and the IFP with 15 seats.
Okay.
So does that give them a majority in the provincial legislature? Yes.
So it'll be interesting to see if they go down that road, though.
So take the view 5 years down the line. Which party is more likely to be sustainable at a provincial level on the assumption that an ANC-DA coalition works at a national level? Now, if an ANC-DA coalition works at a national level, it means that MK effectively is sidelined and has to then make KwaZulu-Natal work. But in 5 years' time, Jacob Zuma is not going to be around.
You really think that?
So he's going to be pushing 90 at that point, on the assumption that his health is
90?
good.
Is he that old?
Jacob Zuma's in his 80s. Jacob Zuma's in his 80s.
Okay.
So,
I know he's in his 80s. I thought he was early 80s.
Well, let's take a view that in 5 years' time.
He's 82,
but
thank
okay,
goodness. Or
okay.
87. All right, fair enough.
So
He's
87.
close to, he's
Yeah,
pushing 90.
so he'll be close to
fair
90.
Enough, fair enough.
So in 5 years' time, is there a logical successor that Jacob Zuma has within the formal MK structures as we know it right now?
His daughter. I mean, she's, people love her.
To my point,
Yes.
the IFP actually has a solid base of intellectual capital.
Yes, it does.
So over the next 5 year period, if there's going to be any leadership that's going to then emerge, it's going to be within the ranks of the IFP. That's actually going to be making a difference in the ground. And more to the point, does that mean at the end of that 5 year period, you're actually likely to then end up seeing a merger between those two parties? I think that there's a strong possibility of that, because there's a lot of shared values that go on there. And we're talking values not just in terms of doing what's best for the people of KZN first and foremost. And we know Zuma's track record, particularly in terms of the northern part of KZN, around building hospitals, building schools, and all of that kind of stuff in the vicinity of Newcastle in particular, which, again, aligns very specifically with the IFP. So if you have an ANC-DA coalition at national level, you have an MK-IFP coalition that's forced to work in KZN, and I believe that it will end up working. And then take a 5 year view, I think it's pretty much inevitable at that point that MK and IFP end up merging.
Interesting. Okay. They end up merging, but they have very different political ideologies.
Well, they have very different ideologies at a national level. At a provincial level, I don't
maybe
really think so.
negligible. Okay, and
those differences don't really make sense because they don't get to control all of the things like nationalizing banks and so forth.
And Joburg, where do you think that's going to go? Do you you think perhaps not Joburg, Gauteng, but Joburg's where it's at. And there I go, pissing off all the Pretoria people. What about? Do you think there's a package deal to be done here? So where the ANC, the DA climb into bed nationally and then say, tell you what, let's work together in Gauteng as well.
That's an interesting one. And I think that Helen is smart enough to not want to couple those two.
Cross the streams.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. She's not going to cross the streams.
Yeah.
I think that any discussion that takes place is going to be fundamentally at the national level,
and then split it,
and then it's split, and then we've already seen that happening because
you've got the numbers in front of you there. What is Gauteng? Who could make a coalition in Gauteng? What can DA do? They got about 30-something%, didn't they?
Yeah, well, 27% versus 34% for the ANC. It's a difference of about 300,000. So you have ANC at 34%, and the EFF at around about 13%, which is not enough to push over the 50% level. So you have
add PA into that. If you add the PA, can they get there?
If they add the PA, no, the PA has got 2%. So it's still not enough. Yeah. So if you take DA at 27%, then you've got MK at close to 10%. So that then pushes them up to 37%. Followed by Action SA at 4%. That's pushing them to 41. Freedom Fund Plus at 2%, 2.5%.
43-ish.
43-ish. Rise at 0.98, so let's say 1%. Now then it becomes a rats and mice thing again. So, yeah, it's going to be...
Well, and I'm going to call it and say that Gauteng is going to remain an ANC province. With others, but I think it will remain an ANC province. Unfortunately, because I think one of the most nefarious people in politics is Panyaza Lesufi. I think it would be wonderful if he was somehow marginalized, but unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen.
So do I think that there's a possibility that the ANC and EFF, so you're going to need to have, so ANC 34%, EFF 13
puts him at 47.
And then
it's not hard to get over 50 there.
47, and then another 2% from the PA,
and Rise will give them their 1%.
You think that Rise will work with them?
100%. Rise are middle class communists.
Okay, because remember right now in terms of actual seats, okay, you've got ACDP 1, BOSAL 1, IFP 1, Rise 1. PA 2, Freedom Front Plus 2, Action SA 3, MK 8, EFF 11, DA 22. So it's not as disastrous as it was in the city of Johannesburg, where you have the likes of Al Jama, AIC, and all of those other guys. Okay, it's a lot tighter in the Gauteng provincial legislature. There's going to need to be some serious hardball that happens at a provincial level. Right now, I can't see a scenario where there's going to be a clear, sustainable alliance.
All right, should we call it at that and see how it unfolds? Because I think, it's enough reading the tea leaves, and we can only do so much with what we have. As you say, I mean, we don't know for sure. You've said it quite clearly. You can't predict. And we'll have to see how it evolves over the next 2 weeks.
It might well be, to your point, that Helen says that we apply a similar premise in Gauteng, that they do at a national level. But of course, in order to get there, they first need to pull off the national level. Is that going to happen?
We shall see. Interesting times, nevertheless. As always, thank you for listening. If you like the podcast, please subscribe, please share it, and leave a comment if you're.
And even if you don't like it, please subscribe and share it.
Yeah, and you can tell us who should have been interviewing who this week. It turns out we're here every week, or every 2 weeks, and we will see you in the next one. Thanks so much. Cheers.